I've driven across Interstate 80 in southern Wyoming more times than I can count, and if you've ever made that trip during winter, you already know how empty it gets after midnight. There are stretches where you can drive 20 or 30 miles without seeing another car, just fences disappearing into darkness and endless rolling hills covered in snow. 3 winters ago, I was driving home from Salt Lake City after helping my uncle move into a new apartment. I left later than I should have, figuring I could make it home before sunrise if I kept a steady pace. The forecast called for light snow, nothing unusual, but by the time I crossed into Wyoming, the weather had changed completely. Thick snow was blowing sideways across the highway. Visibility dropped to maybe 100 feet, and the wind kept pushing my truck toward the shoulder. I slowed to about 45 miles an hour and turned the radio off so I could focus. The silence inside the cab somehow made the storm outside feel even louder. Every few miles I passed an abandoned exit sign or a lonely rest area buried in darkness, but there wasn't another vehicle anywhere in sight. Around 1:40 a.m., my fuel gauge dipped lower than I expected. I knew there was a small gas station near the next exit because I'd stopped there once years before. It wasn't much, just 2 old pumps, a convenience store, and a diner that was usually closed overnight, but it beat risking another 50 miles with the fuel light on. When I pulled off the interstate, the station looked almost abandoned. Only one overhead light was working, flickering every few seconds, and the parking lot was completely empty except for an old blue pickup parked near the side of the building. The convenience store lights were still on, but the front door was locked with a handwritten sign that read, "Closed due to weather." I sighed, wondering if the pumps even worked. They did. I filled the tank, climbed back into my truck, and was about to leave when something caught my eye in the passenger side mirror. A man was standing near the edge of the parking lot. I hadn't seen anyone when I pulled in. He was bundled in a dark winter coat with the hood pulled over his head, standing perfectly still beside the snowbank. I couldn't make out his face because the overhead light never reached him. At first, I assumed he was stranded. Maybe the blue pickup belonged to him. I rolled the passenger window down a few inches and asked if he was okay. He didn't answer right away. After several seconds, he walked toward the truck, slowly enough that I almost rolled the window back up. When he reached the door, he leaned down just enough for me to hear him over the wind. "Can you take me to the next exit?" His voice was calm, not desperate, not cold, just flat. I asked if his truck had broken down. He glanced over his shoulder toward the blue pickup, but never actually looked at it. "Something like that," he said. Normally I would have said no. My parents drilled that into me growing up. Don't pick up strangers. But the temperature outside had to be below 10 degrees. The highway was almost empty, and I couldn't imagine leaving someone out there during a snowstorm. I unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in, closed it quietly, and buckled the seatbelt without saying another word. The first thing I noticed was that snow covered his coat, but none of it melted onto the seat. There weren't any wet spots. His boots left no slush on the floor mat either. I remember thinking that was strange, but I told myself maybe his clothes had already frozen solid outside. We pulled back onto the interstate. For the first few minutes, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the heater fan and the tires cutting through snow. I finally introduced myself. He didn't return the introduction. He simply nodded once while staring through the windshield. Trying to make conversation, I asked where he was headed. "East," he replied. I laughed awkwardly and said, "Yeah, me too. I meant where exactly?" He stayed silent for so long that I assumed he hadn't heard me. Then he quietly said, "I never made it that far." I looked over, expecting some kind of explanation, but he was still staring straight ahead. His reflection in the passenger window looked unusually dark compared to everything else inside the truck. I blamed the storm and kept driving. About 15 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a weak signal and automatically connected to the truck's Bluetooth. Before I could cancel it, a weather alert interrupted the silence. It warned drivers to avoid travel due to whiteout conditions and mentioned that emergency crews were responding to multiple accidents farther east on Interstate 80. The man finally spoke again. "That road has always been dangerous," I nodded. "Looks like it." He slowly shook his head. "Not because of the weather." I waited for him to explain, but he didn't. A few more miles passed. The snow became even heavier, and I could barely see the lane markers anymore. That's when I noticed something odd. Every time I glanced toward him, he was sitting in exactly the same position. He never adjusted his coat, never rubbed his hands together, never reacted when the truck hit rough patches of ice. It almost looked as if he hadn't moved since getting in. Then the dashboard clock changed to 2:17 a.m. At that exact moment, the heater suddenly stopped blowing warm air. Within seconds, the inside of the windshield began frosting over from the passenger side first. I turned the temperature all the way up, but freezing air continued pouring through the vents. My breath became visible. I looked toward the passenger seat to ask if he had noticed it too. And for the first time since he climbed into my truck, he turned his head and looked directly at me. His face wasn't frightening. It was worse than that. It was completely expressionless, pale enough that it almost blended into the snow outside, and his eyes looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept in days. He quietly asked me one question. "Do you know what mile marker this is?" I glanced at the GPS. The screen had frozen. Every number had disappeared. Only the highway line remained. When I looked back at the road, I saw flashing red and blue lights far ahead through the blowing snow, and they weren't moving. The closer I got, the more I realized the lights weren't police cruisers driving toward me. They were parked across the shoulder, lighting up something on the opposite side of the highway. I slowed down to around 30 miles an hour because I couldn't tell if the road was blocked. The man beside me never took his eyes off the windshield. Then, in the same calm voice he'd used the entire drive, he said, "Don't stop." I figured he meant because of the weather, so I nodded and kept rolling forward. As we got within a few hundred yards, I finally saw what everyone was gathered around. A pickup truck had gone through the guardrail and down a small embankment. Its headlights were still on, pointing back toward the interstate. Firefighters and state troopers were standing around it while an ambulance sat nearby with its rear doors open. I remember looking for only a second before turning my attention back to the road. That's when something made the hair on my arms stand up. The wrecked truck was blue, the exact same faded blue as the pickup parked beside the gas station. I looked over at my passenger. He was still staring ahead. "Is that your truck?" I asked. He didn't answer. I asked again, louder this time. Nothing. Thinking maybe he hadn't heard me, I reached over and lightly tapped his shoulder. My hand didn't hit a coat. It hit empty air. The passenger seat was vacant. The seatbelt was still buckled exactly the way he'd fastened it at the gas station, but there was nobody sitting there. I slammed on the brakes out of pure shock and skidded sideways before bringing the truck under control. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I threw the truck into park, jumped out, and opened the passenger door. The seat was empty. No footprints led away from the truck. Fresh snow had already covered the shoulder, leaving only my own tracks where I'd stepped out. I stood there in freezing wind, trying to understand how someone could disappear from a moving vehicle without me noticing. A Wyoming state trooper ran over and asked if I was okay. I pointed toward the passenger seat and tried explaining that someone had just been riding with me. But halfway through the sentence, I realized how impossible it sounded. Instead, I asked what had happened to the blue pickup. The trooper looked back toward the wreck and sighed. "Driver lost control about an hour ago," he said. "Hit black ice. Didn't make it." I asked if he'd been alone. The trooper hesitated before answering. "As far as we know, yes." I couldn't stop staring at the truck below the highway. Even covered in snow, I recognized the dent above the rear wheel and the cracked left taillight. They matched the pickup I'd seen sitting beside the gas station less than 30 minutes earlier. I almost convinced myself there had to be another blue truck parked there, but deep down I knew there hadn't been. Before leaving, the trooper asked if I'd seen anything unusual farther west, because they were still trying to determine exactly where the driver had entered the interstate. I looked toward the exit I'd come from, now barely visible through the storm, and almost told him about the gas station. Instead, I simply said no. I drove the rest of the way home in complete silence. The heater started working again less than a mile after I passed the accident. By the time I reached my driveway, it was nearly 4 in the morning. I didn't sleep much that day. The entire drive kept replaying in my head, especially the moment he asked what mile marker we were at. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I drove back to that exit in broad daylight. The snowstorm was gone, and the sky was perfectly clear. The gas station was open. There were customers inside buying coffee, and both pumps were busy. I went in, bought a bottle of water, and casually asked the older woman behind the counter if they had closed during the storm a few nights earlier. She looked confused. "No," she said. "We've been open 24 hours for years. Truckers need somewhere to stop." I told her I could have sworn the front door had been locked with a handwritten sign that said they were closed due to the weather. She frowned and shook her head. "We don't even have a sign like that." Before leaving, I walked around the side of the building where I'd seen the blue pickup parked. There were no tire tracks because the lot had been plowed, but I noticed something mounted on the wall near the employee entrance. It was a framed newspaper clipping protected behind glass. The headline read, "Local man killed after losing control on I-80 during winter storm." The photograph beneath it showed a smiling man standing beside an old blue pickup. I recognized him immediately. Same face, same coat, same tired eyes. According to the article, the accident had happened in 2018, almost 5 years before the night I picked him up. I stood there reading the article twice because I couldn't accept what I was looking at. The cashier stepped outside a minute later and noticed me staring at it. She quietly said, "People still ask about him sometimes." I asked what she meant. She shrugged and said that every winter, usually during bad storms, travelers occasionally claimed they'd spoken to a quiet man outside the station asking for a ride east. She smiled politely, almost embarrassed, and added that it was probably just an old highway story people liked telling each other. Maybe she's right. Maybe exhaustion, blowing snow, and a long night on Interstate 80 were enough to make my mind fill in details that were never really there. But I still can't explain why my passenger seatbelt was buckled after he disappeared, why the heater froze exactly at 2:17 a.m., or why the man in that newspaper looked exactly like the stranger who asked me for a ride. Since that night, I still drive Interstate 80 every winter. But whenever my fuel gets low, I keep going until the next exit. I don't stop at that gas station anymore, because every now and then, when I pass it after midnight, I can still see someone standing near the edge of the parking lot, waiting for the next ride east.